invite Craigbot here. Is this the one? Yeah, alright, so now we are recording both the gameplay and our voices separately. So let's start. Welcome to the entire Retreat podcast. My name is Ode, and I'm your host. And as per usual, I, together with AI Sky, are flying over real-world locations that connect to the topics in each episode. But today, a special day, and I'm not sure if Frank here knows it, but he's the absolute first remote guest we have on the show. So welcome, Frank. You have to say which name I have to use. You had some alias names as you write, so please, the stage is yours. Who are you? Where are you from? Why did you choose this location, and why did you choose entire Retreat as a podcast option?
Well, that's a lot of questions right out of the chute. Let me start by saying thanks for having me. This is a very unique podcast. I've been on a bunch of different shows, and this is something very different. So I'm excited to experience it. All of the pen names that I use the first name Frank, which is my real first name, just to keep things straight.
Yep.
My real name is Frank Scalise. That's my family name. I write some heartwarming drama, comedy, and hockey-related work under that name.
Oh, hockey related.
Yeah, I'm a big hockey fan. Most of what I've written, though, has been crime fiction. I was a police officer for 20 years and a day, and so probably doesn't surprise folks that that's the kind of stuff that I've written. Although all across the crime genre, not strictly procedurals or detective stories, but also hard-boiled and stuff from the criminal perspective. And I write that under Frank Zafiro. And then the third name is Frank Saverio, which I use to write science fiction and fantasy. Saverio is actually my middle name, so that was a pretty easy choice. So I use the different names just because the genres are so very different, and I think readers, you know, they want to be surprised within the book. They don't want to be surprised that they're, you know, they think they're reading a romance and they have you know, they have a crime novel, or they think they're reading fantasy and they're reading some story about a washed up rock and roll star or something. You know, it's just good for expectations to be met initially. So
Absolutely,
that's why I did that. I'm talking to you from Central Oregon in the United States, a little town called Redmond.
No idea where that is, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, it's on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest of the continental U.S. But I grew up in and around Spokane, Washington, which is in eastern Washington. Yeah, it looks like it. It's a little high up. It's kind of hard to tell exactly. But it looks like we're flying over some residential areas there. So a lot of my crime fiction, especially, takes place in various iterations of Spokane. For the main series that I write, I renamed it River City because I was still a police officer at the time, and I wasn't sure how things were going to go with me writing and what my bosses were going to think. And
of course,
I thought a little anonymity was probably not a bad idea. So I used a pen name and I changed Spokane to River City. And then by the time, you know, I kind of identified myself publicly, and my bosses said, "Hey, that's cool, no problem." I already had, you know, several books out and had established that brand essentially. So it didn't make any sense to change that. So Spokane is an interesting place. People hear about Washington or they hear about the Pacific Northwest. They tend to think about Seattle or Portland, which is on the other side of the Cascade Mountains and is really a lot wetter. region than Eastern Washington. You can see that it's a little drier here than it is in Seattle or down in Portland, Oregon. A lot of coniferous trees, pines, and things like that. And one of the things about Spokane, when you get above the city eventually here, the the more populated area of the town of the city is you can see. I mean, this is a residential area. There's tons of trees. I mean, it's
Yeah, I
very
see.
treed, very treed city. And so when when I write the River City series, it's an ensemble cast of police officers and detectives, and it's a police procedural is the subgenre. I try to bring something of what's unique about Spokane, and thinly veiled Spokane is River City, to the equation. And the heavy treed areas in the residential areas is something that's it's not like it's the only city ever to have that, but it is something somewhat different than you might see in, say, Chicago or Los Angeles or whatever. So that's a difference. Um, Looks like you're flying over the downtown right now,
Maybe, yeah. So the
and
simulator is more
yeah,
or less.
here's
Yeah, sorry for interrupting, but the simulator is more or less true to real life then, as it simulates also the flora, so to say, the trees here.
oh, absolutely,
Oh, all right.
absolutely. It's very treed, and so it looks like we're just. If I'm guessing that I could be wrong there. That doesn't actually. Yeah, that looks like that was the Maple Street Bridge,
Yeah, we flew over a bridge
which is
there.
one
Yeah,
of.
behind
Yeah,
us.
well, you can see looking back, there's actually three bridges there.
Yeah.
The river's a pretty big dividing point for the city. There's only, like any river, there's only so many ways across it, and there are three main bridges in town there, and Maple Street is the longest of them that you just flew over a minute ago. There's another one over by City Hall called it's on Post Street, so it's the very creatively called the Post Street Bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
And there's a pretty big event in the second book with Officer Katie McLeod that happens on that bridge. Pretty gut wrenching event. And so, one of the things that people who are from Spokane or know Spokane at all, who read the River City series in particular, uh, like about it, as we're flying over the West Central neighborhood here right now, is that they recognize their own town and they know,
Mm.
oh, yeah, I know where that is. I know where that happened.
Yeah, exactly.
So you see this sort of diagonal bridge right there that leads.
Yeah, that one maybe.
We're flying over the one. Yeah, so that's the Post Street Bridge right there.
All right. Nice to
And,
pinpoint it.
yeah. So that's what's kind of fun about writing about a place that you've lived. And I think for people who are reading it, is in addition to the story and the characters and everything else that you like about reading a novel, you get to explore a place that
Mm.
or conversely, if you've never been there, you get to experience a place that you've never been to. I mean, there's it really depends on the perspective of the reader.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually my really how to say rough script here. I have written down that yeah, get to know you, then your work and such, and then the city itself. I have the AI actually ready to go when we have some more, let's say, difficult questions. But you already said that, or said part of it at least. I read from your site that you have had a career in both military and law enforcement and education, maybe somewhat relating to that. But is it okay if we go into that some?
Of course.
So the viewers slash listeners know more who you are. Of course, you can be anonymous if you want, but that ship has sailed. So, so yeah, if that's
Yeah,
all right.
quite some time ago.
Yeah. No, I'm wondering also. Not that I'm usually telling a lot about myself. I'm on an alias name I think that's the right phrase. It's not my real name. You can call me Ode or Odd if you want. But yeah, so trying to crash here. Don't use your phone when flying. That's my first tip.
No, I think distracted flying's a pretty big ticket.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we have a police officer or a retired one, but nevertheless, actually I chose a plane also that struggles to keep above 2,000 feet. You see in the right lower corner, the altitude. But
Is it? Mm-hmm.
yeah, so yeah, your military career. If you have, let's say, the possibility and can share anything about it. I'm not sure how secretive or anything like that it is, but I actually had a short stint in the military myself. Of course, in Finland we have this mandatory military. I'm not sure actually what it is currently, but it was back in the day in 2009 when I was a private, so to say. It was half a year, 9 months and 12 months. And I was the full year there. Afterwards, I then were a additional year and worked in the military. Not that I was, let's say, fully I'm not actually. I do not know the right phrase when you are actually working in the military. Maybe.
Well, you're either enlisted or an officer, but you're
Yeah, I mean the
in the U.S.
officer part. Yeah, I was like on
Yeah.
it's not a tryout, but it's a half year that was extended to 1 year,
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
trying out the water, so to say. That if that's my cup of tea, and that's something I like to dive into a little bit if that suits you and it's all right with you.
Yeah, yeah. You don't have to ask permission for anything. Actually, if you
All
have a
right.
question, feel free to ask it. I
Yeah, nice to know.
pretty 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 open. Calling my time in the military a career might be a little bit of an overstatement. I did one enlistment, is what they would call it here in the States. It was a volunteer army at the time, and still is. Not there isn't compulsory service. Um, we have had that in our history, but it wasn't in 1985 when I signed up.
Yeah.
And I signed up about halfway through my final year of school, um, and really did it for a couple of reasons. One was the straightforward patriotic idea of being of service and serving my country. Um, and this was at the height of the Cold War, and so there was some
Yeah.
pretty strong feelings running high at that time, and so I got caught up in that a little bit, and wanted to be, part of serving. But there were practical reasons as well. I mean, here in the U.S., as you probably know, college is not provided for. University is not provided for by the government. It's you have to pay
Yeah,
for
you
it,
have to
and
pay.
it was
Yeah.
pretty expensive then, and it's even more expensive now. And they had a really great college fund program in the Army. You go in for 4 years, and you get a whole bunch of money that you can spend on college. So I thought, hey, this is a great way to serve my country and get some money for college and not have to maybe work as much while I'm going to school. And I was talking to the recruiter uh, at the school there, and my Spanish teacher walked by. It was during the lunch break, and she walked by and saw me in the little office there talking to the recruiter, and she got a little upset. Upset's the wrong word. She got a little emotional
Yeah.
and concerned, and she pulled me aside after class, and she said, "Are you thinking of going in the Army?" And I said, "I'm thinking about it." And I told her why, and she did not like the idea because it just didn't. She was very very liberal woman and didn't really, she worried about all her students, and so the Army didn't seem like a safe place for any of her students to go. But she understood practicality, and she said, "Okay, well, listen, if you're going to do that, you tell him that you want to go to the language school in Monterey, California, and you want to learn to speak a language, and if they won't guarantee that, you won't go in." And I thought, okay, that'd be fun. I mean, I loved Spanish. I was good at it.
Yeah.
It was something I've always done well at in languages, and
Yeah. Yeah.
so I told the guy, exactly what she said, and it's kind of funny. He kind of poo-pooed me a little bit at first. He kind of brushed me off a little bit, and kind of had the, well, that's really hard to get into, and like, wasn't too, he had other things I think he wanted to stick me into that would have, filled the criteria he had to, fill for his bosses. But I stuck to my guns because, I love that teacher. Mrs. O'Halloran was her name. And, I trusted her. So finally he said, all right, let's go take the test. And that's a whole long story I won't bore you with, but I went and took the test and I did pretty well on it, and
Yeah.
his attitude changed, and I ended up getting the, exactly what I asked for. And so I spent a year in Monterey, California, beautiful, beautiful place, learning to speak Czech.
Yeah. I actually read about that.
And
One of my questions. But yeah, please continue.
one of Well, at the time is, I mean, I'm sure you know your history and your European history. I mean, at the time, it was Czechoslovakia. It was
Mm-hmm.
one country, and it was part of the Warsaw Pact, which was, opposed to NATO, and it was, a big, Cold War going on.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
learned Czech, ended up going to Germany and spending 2.5 years there. And I sat at I did a couple different things. I was trained to sit at a radio position with headphones on and listen to the Czech army talk and intercept what they were talking about and identifying what they were doing by those interceptions and forwarding it on to analysts. But at
Yeah.
one of the duty stations that they sent me to, they didn't have a listening mission, an intercept mission. So I ended up having to cross train as an analyst and be the one that got that information and figured out what they were up to. So I got cross-trained and did both jobs. But it was a pretty exciting time to be doing that because during the time I was in Germany, and part of this active mission against the Czech army, the Velvet Revolution occurred, and Czechoslovakia kind of shook itself loose of the Soviet yoke.
Yeah.
And they elected a poet as president. You don't get much further from communism than that, I don't think.
Yeah.
Um, and then the Berlin Wall came down, and Germany started on its path to reunification. So it was pretty momentous events to be there as a man in his early 20s. Kind of with a ringside seat to history. It was pretty fascinating. And I got a lot out of my time in the military, but I came to understand pretty quickly that it wasn't the career for me. There were just too many things about it that didn't sit well with me. I asked why too much, I think, and I didn't have a lot of patience for doing pointless things for no reason whatsoever. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
those are a
Yeah.
couple of things that happen in the Army quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you must have discovered something along those lines yourself
Yeah.
if
I
your
was about to
trial
say.
period didn't work out.
Yeah. It's a more or less an international culture. You there's a little some you can of course do. Let's say my if I shortly join in here, my short experience is even more a far-fetched career, as you spoke earlier or mentioned it just now. So you have your basic period and you integrate yourself with bigger, let's say, parts of the whole system. But yeah, the culture in general, it's really, we have in Finland, or back then at least in '09, it's some time ago, we had and I think we have videos nowadays on YouTube even where they kind of ease you into the whole culture, that hey, don't be afraid, this is different, and try to have a slight light-hearted twist to it. So, but yeah, I am of the same opinion that there are absolutely situations where you have to dig a little deeper. It's not maybe that you are done wrong, but sometimes you are in a gray zone. Of course, that's something that is then taken under a magnifying glass and corrected. It's not something that the military wants to do, but we have so many different individuals and personalities in one place, so there's a high likelihood that there's some friction, let's say, between different humans. So then I imagine that.
Well, they used to
Yes,
say.
ask.
Well, I was just going to say they used to say that there's the right way, there's the wrong way, and there's the army way.
Yeah.
And and I of course I was in my early 20s, so things like that I didn't like. I bucked under that sort of scenario, but I'm 55 now, and so I look back and I'm like, well, like you said, there's they definitely have to be concerned about the needs of the many and what works for the many. And so, a lot of considerations for the one fall by the wayside as a result of that. And it's just it's a necessity of the organization. It's just the way that it works. I just knew it wasn't going to work for me.
So, that's great.
So like you, I elected to not to continue with my enlistment. And I left in 1991.
Yeah. I said, what was it, something like 86 to 91? But my follow-up is kind of then I'm not sure if it must have, but is it wrong to assume that you had something you gained then? Because I imagine that the law enforcement career is also a well-structured career in the way that you actually have a, let's say, clear boss sorry, rambling here, trying to find the words, but what I'm meaning that it's not the most let's say dynamic and free environment when we think about army and the law enforcement. Is that right to assume? Even though I think that the law enforcement has maybe some more creativity or a room for creativity.
Yeah, I mean, you're not working for Google. There's
good comparison
for sure. I am very grateful for having been in the military. I'm proud of the fact that I served. I am grateful for what the Army did for me. I think that for some people, many people, the military service can be a great half step into adulthood. Because,
I agree.
And you have all that additional responsibility, but there's a safety net there. You're always going to have a place to stay, clothes on your back, and food to eat, and so you can learn life skills that will help you later on without quite as much risk of falling between the cracks and being homeless or starving or whatever. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that, I have when I got my bachelor's degree, I paid for that with the money I got from going to the military. The Army College Fund paid for my bachelor's degree. And so I'm grateful for that as well. And in the U.S. here, there are certain benefits accorded to veterans. The two largest ones that I took advantage of is that they have a home loan program, VA loans, Veterans Administration loans, that allow you to purchase a home with no down payment. So if you can afford to make the payment on the house, but you don't have, enough money set aside to make the down payment to make the initial purchase, you're able to, that's waived. And so, if you can afford a $100,000 house, but you don't have $20,000 to put down on it, you can still get into that house. And so I bought a couple of homes in my life that way. And then the other thing is certain government and other employers give veterans preference. And in other words, when they're doing a process of assessment, you get a few extra points on your side because you were a veteran. And so when I was hired by the police department, about 600 people took the exam It's about every 2 years at the time.
Yeah.
And I ended up 10th on the list of 600. But part of the reason I scored so highly was that I got an extra 5 points, I think, due to being a veteran, which a number of other people did as well. It's not an uncommon path to go from the military into law enforcement. But I mean, I probably got hired a good 6 months to a year sooner than I otherwise would have because of the veterans preference points getting me higher on the list. So I wouldn't change a thing about having gone into the military, and I have great respect for people who are doing that today. I just think, you have to know what's going to work for you and what's going to make you happy, and that's something I was fortunate enough to realize at that time. You're right though about there are some parallels between law enforcement and the military. It is a structured chain of command. There's a service to the community equation that I think is very much similar to service to the country. And of course, they're both uniformed. There's a martial component to it. Obviously, you carry a weapon. You may have to encounter violence. You may have to employ violence. These things exist. There's an authority in both settings, but they're very different as well. I mean, when you're policing in a civilian setting, I don't think it's useful to think of yourself as being in a war. I think that's counterproductive. But certainly there are a lot of parallels, and so. Having been in the military, it was easy to understand the chain of command. It was easier to understand your place and your role in the organization right out of the gate. You didn't have to learn that, some of the formalities and so forth were also pretty easy to adapt to. But again, it's a completely different job too, and there's a lot to learn. And the thing about the job that's difficult is that there's a very broad number of skills that you have to become proficient at to at least a middling depth, if not considerable depth. So it's not a niche job. It's not like, I mean, if you're a lumberjack, and I'm not hating on lumberjacks, they have a very dangerous and important job. But if you're a lumberjack, you're cutting down trees, and there's a lot of that goes into that, but it's a narrow band. You have to be really, really good at it. It goes very deep, but it's narrow. Well, in policing, you have to be much broader. I mean, you have to be able to drive a vehicle, shoot a weapon, be proficient in physical confrontation. You have to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to know the law. You have to be able to apply the law. You have to be able to write a cogent report. You have to be able to make decisions about how the law will be interpreted in the context of the situation that you're in. You have to, I mean, and there's computer proficiency. There's, I mean, it just goes on and on. And none of those proficiencies can be surface level. You have to at least have a middling, adequate level of proficiency within those, or you're not going to be able to do the job. And in fact, the police officers in my career that I saw who were not successful were often very, very good at 2 or 3 things, but also not very good at a couple of other things. And those 2 or 3 things that they were poor at really handcuffed their ability to do the overall job well. I think that's one of the things that makes the job so difficult is there's such a breadth of different skills that aren't necessarily related to each other. I mean, there's not a lot of crossover between being able to interview or interrogate someone, or just having social skills to be able to talk to someone, and shooting a firearm or driving a car. I mean, the Venn diagram there is 3 circles, I mean, there's not a lot of crossover. But to be good at the job, they have to merge, and there has to be some crossover there. So
really wide set of skills.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually read a little into again your online site. Um, you started by patrolling, and you can stop me if I'm wrong and correct me also. But you started by patrolling the streets as a patrol officer, then a corporal, then a detective. Um, After that leadership, including even K9s and such. Um, could I ask you? I'm not sure. I have limited knowledge regarding this, but is there a different field or a separate field or specific field? You said that you have the vast set of skills that you have to have, like the basic skills. But were there something that you were then like specifically working on? As let's say worth a detective or something like that.
Yeah, the so I would look at it this way, like every police officer would need to have, let's say there were 20 different skills that you're measuring and on a scale of 1 to 100. I think every police officer would need to be at like 50 in every one of those skills,
Everyone, yeah.
hopefully, right? That's where that's like the baseline. But then if you get into, like, when I was promoted to corporal, the role of the corporal was threefold. You took evidentiary photos and collected physical evidence, and you did traffic collision investigations at a advanced level. And that's in addition, of course, to, you still did the other things that police officers were doing. But when an officer needed a photograph, you went and took the photograph. If there were fingerprints that needed to be lifted at the scene and they weren't calling out the forensic specialists, it was not a crime that rose to that threshold. You were the one that went and lifted fingerprints. And so taking a photograph and lifting fingerprints, you better be above a 50 in both of those skills if you're going to be a corporal.
Yeah.
Same thing with investigating crashes. And a very similar sort of dynamic exists when you become a detective. Your first experience as a detective is more general. You're working on usually you're working on property crimes, burglaries and thefts and things like this. And then as you proceed in your career, the opportunity might open up to specialize a little bit more. So maybe you become a fraud detective and you deal strictly in fraud, or maybe you become a homicide detective or a sex crimes detective. And so your skill in that area would spike up into the 90s, hopefully, because you need that amount of expertise to do that specific job. I was only a detective for 2 years, and so my detective experience was largely at the general. I investigated mostly property crimes. I did investigate some serious crimes against persons because our department wasn't so huge that we didn't have times when our major crimes or detectives who investigated the homicides and robberies and serious assaults and sexual assaults weren't overtaxed. They had too many cases, and so a case would come along that, hey, it's a sexual assault. It has to be investigated. It's not one that can be just, some property crimes, if we don't have the people and there's no real investigative avenue to follow, that crime might be suspended, which really means basically not investigated, or the investigation halted because there's nowhere else to go. Well, you can't just do that with the crimes against persons, at least not initially. You have to investigate it and see if you can solve it. And so those spillover crimes, cases rather, would be assigned to people like me who weren't in the major crimes unit, but were a detective and could work the case. So most of the larger cases that I worked would tend to come about in that fashion. And I was glad for it because crimes against persons has a great deal of impact on the individual, and you want to try to help them. And let's just face it, it's a more interesting case than working 20 burglary cases. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
anybody does anything for a period of time, a change is nice. But 2 years is not enough time to become in the 90s, proficiency wise, I don't think.
Uh-huh.
But it certainly, you hone your craft over that period of time. Now, leadership is another thing entirely. It's a skill set that you have to work on and learn, and it's a behavior that that you can use to. I'm being distracted by the radio chatter there. It's the old cop in me is coming out. When the radio kicks on, you stop and listen. Might be an emergency.
Yeah. No problem.
But
Something
anyway,
flying in the
so
air
once
here
I
also. I'm not sure what.
oh wow. So is that somebody else in the game, or is that like a real world plane?
I think it's a real world plane simulated. It simulates the actual flight path, I think. Yeah, it's shown in the VFR map on the upright or in the upright corner. So I think it's a simulated path, so to say. But yeah, continue. I had some questions about the leadership role, and especially you have worked with animals also, I see. So, sorry, again, use your smartphone while flying. Not a good idea when you have a police officer in the chat here or in the podcast. But yeah. So, what did you like? If you can, of course, and your answer here. But then regarding dogs, do you have ones yourself? And what's the let's say main difference between being a leadership or not in a leadership role, and then especially working with patrols that have animals in them?
I do have a dog. He's a very old, he's 15, dog named Richie. I named him after my favorite hockey player.
Oh, I'm trying to guess
here. Well, I'll give you some context. He was a puppy in 2009, and my team that I'm a fan of in the NHL is the Philadelphia Flyers. And so I named him after the captain of the team at the time, which is Mike Richards.
All right.
Hell of an all-around player. Had all the pieces that make a good hockey player, in my mind, anyway. So named him my dog Richie. So the thing about leadership, I think that some people don't think about is somebody who's a really good person at the job, whatever that is, in this case being a police officer, may or may not be good at being a police leader. And somebody who is maybe not as great at the police job, maybe they're a mediocre performer, could actually excel, because the reality is that leadership is a completely different set of skills. Now, does it pay huge dividends to understand the job and to have done the job and to know the nuances of the job? Absolutely, of course. In fact, I think that's a critical piece to doing a good job as a leader. But the reality is that leadership is a completely different skill set than whatever the job is that you're leading. And sometimes people don't make that transition to embracing that skill set and improving it and addressing it in a way that makes it possible for them to be of service to the people that they're leading. And so, I didn't really think about leadership before I was promoted. In the culture of the police department at the time, the promotional cycle was every 2 years. And so it was just something that you did, that you took the test when it came along. Whatever tests you were eligible for, you took them because that's what you did. And so I did. And I was a detective at the time. It was the second time I took the sergeant's exam. I was a detective. I was super happy being a detective. My goal was to become a homicide detective and to become the best detective I could possibly be. And so I was happy. I was thrilled. And so when I took the test, I was pretty loose and easy and not too concerned. And I did okay on it. I came out 12th on the list of probably 45 or 50 people. So, not great, but not bad. And they usually took the first 10 to an assessment center to move on to the next step of the process. And so I figured out, well, I'm not in the top 10. That's fine. I'm happy being a detective. I did my duty. I took the test like everybody says you have to. And I went back to my case files and started working cases. And then the news comes out, they're actually taking 12 to the assessment center. And so I'm going to the assessment center. So, all right, I'll go. It's good batting practice for if I ever really, really, really want to promote. And so once again, I got nothing to lose and I'm happy in my job. So I was super loose and easy as I went through the process. I wasn't worried about making mistakes, just, went in and was authentically myself. And at the end of the assessment center, the promotional list comes out and I'm sitting number 2.
All right.
Which is a pretty huge jump in that day. And so it kind of poleaxed me a little bit because suddenly I was struck upside the head with the realization that I was going to be promoted. There's, almost no doubt they were going to promote about 4 off of that list that they knew of at the time. And so I had to kind of rectify that reality with my brain and think to myself, well, geez, what does that mean? And so took I can't remember, I guess, how long it took before I got promoted. It was during the first year of the list anyway. And I had to start thinking about, what is my leadership philosophy? How am I going to approach leadership? And, to their credit, the police department at the time, they try to prepare you for it, and they send you to a week-long first level supervision class, which unfortunately the one that the state had in the state training commission had in place at the time was kind of a joke. Wasn't very, very good. And so you're still kind of left on your own to either find a mentor or figure it out on your own. And this will probably make you laugh. Most people think it's goofy and nerdy as hell, but as I started thinking about it, what did I see in the military leaders that I liked and didn't like, police leaders that I liked and didn't like? Where else have I examined leadership in my life? And I was a huge Star Trek fan. Yes, I still am. When I was growing up, and of course, given the time period that I was growing up, the only Star Trek was the original series, and Captain Kirk was my hero. And so I actually started thinking about it very, very. Well, I started thinking about it very critically, and I asked, myself, what did Captain Kirk care about in a leadership role? He cared about 2 things. Cared about his people, and sometimes that came out in, caring about the ship, but he cared about the ship because it held the people, and the mission. People in the mission. These were the 2 things. And so to me, those 2 things seemed like they should become like a pair of railroad tracks or a train, and that they both had to be in alignment and parallel to each other and work together. And that's how things got done. And so I kind of lived by the mantra of, what would Kirk do? And kind of ran it through that, problem solving thought process to kind of get an idea what might make for good leadership. And it worked for me. It worked for me because my focus was on accomplishing the mission and taking care of my people. Well, sometimes the mission's going to have to suffer a little bit because your people's needs are stronger. Other times, the people that you're leading are going to have to sacrifice a little bit to accomplish the mission. There's give and
Yeah.
take there, but
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
both always a consideration. And so that was how I how I framed my leadership journey for a very long time. And even when I got some much better training, much deeper training in a couple of different programs, I didn't find anything in any of that advanced, command training that contradicted my original thought process of care for your people and accomplish the mission. And so that's something I still adhere to today, even though I'm not leading anyone actively. Um, so as far as your question about the dogs and leading people with animals, that
Yeah.
was a wonderful experience. And leading both the canine unit and the SWAT unit occurred while I was at the rank of lieutenant. And in both instances, I was assigned the command position to an elite unit, never having
Mm-hmm.
been a member of that unit as an operator. So I'm in charge of, 7 canine handlers and their dogs, and I was never a canine handler.
Oh, all
And
right.
so there's a recipe for disaster there if you're not careful, right? Um, and so I approached it with the attitude of, I don't know this job. They do. I don't know what they need from me so that they can do their job. So I I need to learn. I need to learn
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that. And so I tried to approach it with a great deal of humility and a learning heart. And the thing about canine handlers, the thing about SWAT team members, is you cannot do those jobs without being extremely dedicated to the job that you're doing. The level of expertise, I talked about a 1 to 100 scale, of skill set, they've got to be at the 97, 98, baseline to do that job. And so as such, they have a lot of passion for it. They have a lot of knowledge. And if you approach them with a humble and learning heart, they are quite literally overjoyed to share their knowledge with you. And so I never became an expert in any as a canine and an expert in canine. I never became an expert in SWAT tactics like they were, but I came to understand far more than a layperson, and I came to understand enough to where when I needed to go to my bosses and say, "Hey, we need $15,000 because we need to buy a new dog
Yeah.
because we need to prepare for the future here," and they look at me and go, "Your oldest dog is 5, What do you mean?" And I could say, "Well, here's the lifespan of the dog. Here's the spin up time that it takes to get a dog street worthy. If we buy the dog now, we have about a 6-month overlap, so we have a cushion." And I can answer all those questions with some, with the authority of actual knowledge,
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than reading from a 3x5 card of notes that I took at the last minute or something like that. And of course, this approach, obviously, it was beneficial in terms of doing my job and beneficial for the unit accomplishing its mission, but it had the ancillary effect of enriching my life and my knowledge base. And so selfishly, when I look back on it now, I'm grateful to it, not just for the experience, which I'm hugely grateful for, but the knowledge that I don't necessarily have to seek out in my own writing. I can write about the canine officers' actions in a fictional setting with some authority. And if I'm not certain, I have resources I can still reach out to get that information, even though I've
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
retired for 11 years. Same thing with SWAT, and same thing with investigations. I mean, all the things in my career, I developed a proficiency of either ability or knowledge that's really helped me in my writing career. Um, the other piece that was great about it, though, was um, it really fostered a wonderful relationship with those dog handlers and with those SWAT team operators. that is difficult to put into words, but you know, in many units like that, in many departments, the team commander is not necessarily truly part of the team. They sit a little bit apart from the team a lot of times, and it was nice to feel like I at least was closer to being accepted as part of the team.
Yeah.
Even though my proficiency level, physical proficiency, wasn't the same as theirs, you know, at least at the heart level, I was accepted, and that meant something to them too, because it meant to them that they had somebody in a leadership position who was invested, who cared about them as an individual, not just as a cog in the machine that would be used to accomplish the mission. And so, you know, I look back at those experiences, which was, you know, which accounted for just a couple, maybe 3 years of my career. And it's some of my greatest memories in my law enforcement career, and some of the most emotionally satisfying ones.
I can imagine.
And you know, the canine officers in particular are pardon the pun, but they're a different breed.
Yeah.
You know, they bond with that dog in a very special way that I think most people can imagine, but probably aren't even close in their imaginings to how tight that bond is and how in sync they are. And the amount of training that goes into that position, both initially and ongoing, is mind-boggling. I mean, when they're on patrol and they're not being called to assist, they're very often taking opportunities within the shift to go and do a quick bit of training with the dog to keep the dog sharp and to meet those training requirements, because they're very stringent. I Yeah, the canine unit was a wonderful unit. They were very disciplined. They were very, very dedicated. In fact, they were so dedicated that the only real conflict I ever had with any of them as the leader, and I say this slightly with tongue in cheek,
Yeah.
was that they would frequently work and or train and try not to put in for the overtime hours or the compensatory time, because they knew budgets were tight, and they knew if you know there's a certain amount of training and work that had to be done, but the budget couldn't support it. So they would do 100% of the work, even if the budget would only support paying for 70% of it. And then they knew if the pay for all of it was meted out, that it would cut back even further, and they didn't want that. So they basically
Yeah.
tried to volunteer their time constantly. And I mean, I admired that, and I appreciated where that sentiment came from, but it violated the labor contract, and
Yeah. All right.
was not something I could endorse or allow. But it was also something I couldn't stop, because they simply wouldn't tell me. They simply take the dogs out and train for a couple hours, and they train for 3 hours, and they put in a card for one. And what I didn't know didn't hurt me until I found out about it, a month later. And what am I going to do then? And it wasn't a true conflict. It was just, they were so dedicated that they didn't want to see the program suffer. They didn't want to see the patrol division that they were supporting suffer, because, we couldn't afford to have officers covering during certain times of the day because of budget, because it was being spent on training. Well, if I only put in for 1 hour of training, even though I did 3, then that's 2 more hours that can be budgeted towards supporting patrol. So,
Yeah. Give and take.
yeah. And so, I mean, in a private corporation, I think people would be happy to take advantage of that. And, but in a government operation with a labor contract, it wasn't something I could endorse or tacitly allow, implicitly allow rather. But so that's like the equivalent of going on a job interview and somebody saying, tell us your greatest weakness, and the applicant says, "Oh, I care too much," or I work too hard, or I'm too honest. I mean, but it's true. It's true. That was really the only conflict between myself and any of the members of the team that I can remember that that was of any significance whatsoever. The level of professionalism and dedication was outstanding. And then I went from there to the SWAT team, which was about 40 people at the time, and it was the same thing. It was the same high level of proficiency, the same high level of dedication. It was like being drafted to a championship team, right? It's already a championship team, and now you're a member of it, and so you're motivated to uphold the standard that they've set and to not let them down, because they've earned their standing, and they deserve for you to make sure that they maintain it. So I can't say enough good things about those two units in particular. Although, all of them, well, the K9 unit was a full-time gig. You're a K9 officer 100% of the time. The SWAT unit was an ancillary duty. So you had your main duty, and then you additionally worked as a member of the SWAT team and trained and were called out when necessary. So that the department wasn't large enough to merit a standing SWAT team. Generally in the United States, your largest cities like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, they're big enough to afford that and to need that. Most agencies, it's on a call-out basis.
Yeah. I'm actually finding so many segues here. You are really well spoken and explain it good in a good manner. But we talked a little bit about leadership and how you implement what you have learned throughout your career in your writing. So I actually have one question we could maybe shortly go through. We have, for my part, we have an hour still left on the table. But can I ask you one thing regarding the culture change? As you have been working in the law enforcement for a while and are now retired, but we have this. How do you say? We are bombarded almost by the social media nowadays, and I noticed and actually got the thought just a little bit before we had the podcast schedule starting here, that do you have an opinion regarding the difference back when you started and now? What's the main differences that you see in the everyday mundane patroller's life, so to say, and specifically this cultural phenomenon? And I'm not sure if I am now using the right phrase, but I actually had to Google it, but I here in Finland even see this so-called cop watching or cop watchers on social media, where people quite often seem to, and I emphasize seem to because I do not know what the real life there are for a officer, but maybe you know what I'm talking about. People are recording law enforcement in their duty, asking them even quite rudely for their I'm not sure if the right phrase is badge number and their names, and even kind of questioning that are they doing the right thing in that situation. Do you understand what I'm asking here?
Absolutely.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Well, I should tell you that I retired in 2013, and in September of 2013, and in 2014 I actually started teaching police leadership across the U.S. and Canada. So I had the opportunity for several years to see police departments all over the country and all over Canada up close in those training sessions. It's a 3-week training course, very intensive. You do a week and then come back a month later and do week 2, and then come back in the third month for the final week. And, the classes are 24 to 48 people in the class. And so you have a wide range of, officers from various ranks and civilians who work for the agency as well. And so you get a lot of different perspectives. And one thing it did for me was it really opened my eyes to those things about my own experience in my career that were
Yeah.
very unique and those things that were very universal. And also gave me some perspective on where we thought we were pretty good at something and we were pretty average, and where we thought we were pretty good at something and we actually were pretty good at it. It's almost like, small town kid leaving home and going to the big city, and, kind of experienced in a way.
Yeah.
And so in this process, I did stop doing that at the end of 2017 because I was traveling too much. I started doing it again last year. And so I'm doing it again now, teaching leadership and having these interactions. And so what that did obviously was, it allowed me to get the perspective of a lot of different people from a lot of different places, but all part of the larger law enforcement community. And so in addition to that, being retired and not being in the job, not having the needs, some of which are very emergent, of the job in your face 24 hours a day, really allowed me a little bit of perspective that I couldn't have gained, I don't think, while on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to see where there are cracks in the profession in terms of accepted beliefs or attitudes or biases or strategic errors, and so forth. And so I'm critical of the profession in some ways, but also very protective of it.
Yeah.
So to get to your question of the cop watching phenomenon, I think there's a lot of things that go into that. I think that's like
Naturally,
that question
yeah.
could be an entire podcast
Yeah.
for sure. But in to try to put it as succinctly as possible, I think that for a variety of reasons, some of which the police are responsible for and some of which are outside of their control and that the society at large is responsible for, but all of these different factors have resulted in many places a degradation or decline in the relationship between many police communities, or police agencies and the communities that they serve. And when trust declines, like in any relationship, relations become strained, and trust is something that is very fragile. And if you don't trust someone, then you question them. I mean, imagine if you're married and you're worried that your spouse is unfaithful. I mean, then everything that person does is going to be seen through that lens of, well, did she go to the grocery store, or did she have a meeting with her lover, or something? I mean, you're having these kinds of thoughts if that's the kind of trust issue that you have. Well, that manifests itself in terms of the police agency and the community. If so an arrest is being made, or if it's a violent arrest for some reason, somebody just standing there doesn't know the entirety of the situation. They don't know why the officer is even there. They don't know what the reason for the arrest is. They don't know the background of the person that's being arrested. Maybe they're a violent felon who's fought with police on every occasion in which they've been arrested, and they're being arrested for an outstanding murder warrant. I mean, you don't know. The guy might be screaming that he's being arrested for jaywalking or spitting on the sidewalk, but that doesn't mean it's true. And so, people sometimes jump to conclusions based on the bias they already hold, and those conclusions may or may not be accurate. We don't always help ourselves out as police agencies because we don't always do a great job of communicating the actual
facts in a timely manner. And sometimes we can't do that because of the fact that it's an ongoing investigation. But, our default is always not to share information. And that can sometimes be very detrimental. And it certainly doesn't increase the trust factor. And so I think that's going on. I think that it's become there have been some high profile incidents in which police abuse or a bad action, by the police either did occur or appears to occur. And that erodes trust. And then people start looking at it, like that's happening again. It's just like this event, or it's just like that event. And as that has ramped up over the last decade, I think there are people out there who think that they're doing something helpful by shining a light on police activity, which in general, I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, we serve the public. We are the public. We do our work in the public eye. There are very few things that a police department does that would lose their effectiveness if they were shown to the public. I mean, undercover operations are obviously the one glaring example of this that would suffer. But most everything we do should be shared with the public. And then I do think there's some generational things going on too. I think that the younger I'm Gen X, right? So there's a couple of generations behind me that are now entering adulthood. And they've done so with social media as a huge piece of the equation. And so to them, it's less of an invasion or less of it's just not a big deal to put a camera on somebody. And so I think that's a factor too. And we've also, I mean, this might sound a little preachy or soapboxy, but a lot of the entertainment that's out there is reality television or something similar, and that has a subset within it of kind of this kind of gotcha TV, like where people are looking to find fault with what someone else is doing and or catch them in a mistake or a lie or a bad act. And I think some people figure if they put their cameras on the cops, they're going to catch some cop doing something wrong. And occasionally they will, because cops are human and some cops do stupid things. And occasionally somebody who shouldn't be an officer, they slip through the rather stringent screening process that most agencies have. And so it's going to happen. But often the whole story isn't known. And also often not often, but frequently the entire video isn't shown either. And so context is everything, and
I agree,
sharing the context. I mean, I think if I were in police leadership today, I would, if I were a police chief or something, I would institute a procedure or policy that very quickly addressed these sorts of things whenever possible. I mean, it would be worth the resources, spending the resources to have somebody, a public relations team, a public information officer, and maybe a couple of social media experts who, when something happens and somebody posts a video and says, "Oh, look what this police department did," to address it head on. If there's more video, show the entirety of it. If there's details that can be shared, share those. And not to the degree that you're chasing your tail on every person out there who has something bad to say, you're jumping on it. But those that are being watched and looked at by a great number of people and have the potential to negatively influence somebody's opinion in a way that is based on something that isn't objectively true, you want to counter that. And so I think I think it's worth dedicating resources to doing that. And that's not something that we've done very well historically as a profession. We've taken a very paternal, protective attitude historically, and basically kind of said, kind of patted the public hand on their hands and said, don't worry about it. We've got this. Just go live your life. And there was a time where the culture of the United States was such that that's what people wanted from their police, and that's what they were glad to get. And that's not the case now. That's not what the public wants. It's not what the public needs. And so we can't persist in approaching things that way. Now, again, I've been retired for 11 years. I am absolutely certain if I went out and did a search, I would find numerous agencies who are doing exactly what I'm saying, and who become experts at doing this. Because, one thing about police officers is very early on, you learn to be adaptive, you learn to be nimble and agile, and that isn't just in a physical sense on emergency calls. It translates to more of a strategic sense when the way that the world is working changes underneath you. So the other piece to it too that you've alluded to is, I do think that there's a little more vitriol. Well, not a little more. There's certainly more vitriol that is directed towards the police in general by a larger segment of the population than there was when I was on the job, and when when the people that were retiring when I came on the job, when they started. So the last couple of generations of police officers, probably the ones today are facing a greater amount of a lack of respect and vitriol. I mean, there's a you probably heard the term "all cops are bastards." This is a slang term that's out there. That's pretty widespread.
I haven't heard that one actually, but continue.
ACAB people. I was at a writers conference in Albuquerque, and walking back from dinner one night with some other writers, and there's a couple in front of us, and one guy was tattooed up pretty heavily, and of course it's Albuquerque, it's pretty warm. He was wearing a tank top, and right there on his arm was the numbers. Let's say be 1213, and then on the other arm it was ACAB, right, which both mean the same thing.
All right. All right.
So if people are feeling strongly enough about a sentiment to have the symbol for that sentiment tattooed on their body, that tells you something. And
that tells you something.
I think it's more prevalent than it used to be. It certainly seems so, talking to the officers in the classes that I teach, and watching the news and social media as you described. I don't think it's universal. I also think it's cyclical. I think, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers, in September 2001, there was a huge outpouring of respect and admiration for emergency services workers, cops, firemen, medics. It was, I couldn't buy a cup of coffee for like a year. You go in someplace to get coffee and they wouldn't let you pay. You end up throwing money in the tip jar to cover it, but because you don't want to be seen to be taking, gratuities. But that was the sentiment, thank you for your service. I bet the number of times I've heard that in my life, as a police officer, I would bet that about 60% of the instances happened, between like 2001 and 2003, because there was such a heightened sense of that appreciation during that time period. And of course, that was 20 years ago. The pendulum has swung absolutely the other direction now, because of events that have occurred, some of which, the police acted poorly or in bad judgment, other times where that's the perception, even if it isn't the reality. And so it's a more difficult job now. that breadth of skills that we talked about earlier
Yeah,
has
yeah,
gotten broader, and the necessary depth. I don't think you can be successful at a 50% anymore. I think you got to be up to 60 in many of those skills just to do a baseline job. And so, my appreciation for the work that the good men and women in that profession do, and my frustration and anger at those few who blatantly do a poor job or even are act in a criminal fashion has grown. Both of those.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for answering the question. I was actually slightly hesitant if I would bring it up, but as you said, I can ask you more or less about anything, and that was one that crossed my mind.
Well,
So
if you can't talk about it, how are you going to solve the
yeah,
issue?
yeah, true. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, and that's true of anything, right? So, the real problem is, regardless of what we're talking about, if it's a sensitive subject, and by sensitive, I just mean something one or both parties care about strongly, um, y- y- people seem to be struggling these days, at least in my country, with having a civilized, calm, and nuanced discussion about those
Yeah, yeah,
topics, whatever they might be. Instead, it's a very polarized discussion in which folks aren't necessarily even listening to each other. They're just either waiting for their turn to shoot down the argument that was just made, or
yeah,
chanting slogans at each other, or whatever. And that's not effective problem solving at all. In fact, that just pushes, the two sides of the problem, if there are in fact two sides, further apart.
yeah, true. Um, if I may, I actually want to kind of cover some few topics still here. So the third part, kind of your life, and I assume, and I want you to feel free to promote if you want. But you are a established writer, a novelist. That you said earlier that you have gotten a lot of inspiration from your work. I can only imagine, and you have explained really in detail this. So we have that in the background. But now, actually, I'm trying to introduce the AI here, just to see that if it tells us the truth. So, hey Sky, could you say hey to Frank Scalise, a established author that we have as the podcast guest today? You talked about him with me earlier, and we're kind of on the latter half of the podcast here right now, and flying over Spokane, if I pronounce that right. And yeah, in general, could you share a comprehensive and detailed overview about his author career and what he has published up until this day?
Hey Frank, it's great to have you on Entired Retreat. We've been diving deep into your work and flying over the beautiful Spokane area, if I pronounce that right. So Frank Scalise,
Alright.
aka Frank Zafiro or Frank Saverio, is an established author whose career is as captivating as the stories he writes. Starting his law enforcement career in Spokane, Frank served over 20 years with the Spokane Police Department, retiring as a captain. This deep, first-hand experience lends a striking authenticity to his crime novels, which explore the intricacies of life on both sides of the badge. Under the pen names Frank Zafiro and Frank Saverio, Frank has authored several notable works. His River City series is particularly renowned, painting a gritty, realistic picture of a fictionalized version of Spokane. Some key titles in this series include Under a Raging Moon, Heroes Often Fail, and Beneath a Weeping Sky. The series digs into the lives of cops and criminals alike, often set against familiar Spokane backdrops like Riverfront Park and the historic Davenport Hotel. Another significant work is the Charlie 316 series, co-written with Colin Conway. This series starts with Charlie 316 and includes follow-ups like Never the Crime and Code 4. These books delve into the complex dynamics of modern policing, tackling themes of corruption, morality, and justice. In addition to these series, Frank has also written standalone novels and contributed to various crime fiction anthologies, showcasing his versatility as a writer. His works often highlight the human side of law enforcement, providing readers with a nuanced view of the challenges and moral dilemmas faced by police officers. Frank's personal interests, like playing hockey, his military background, and his self-proclaimed status as tortured guitarist, often seep into his narratives, adding layers of depth and relatability to his characters. His rich life experiences and keen observations make his novels not just thrilling reads, but also insightful explorations of the human condition. So Frank, your career and body of work have clearly left a significant mark on the crime fiction genre. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, so there you go, an introduction to the AI. I planned to actually introduce it earlier, but our discussions were so interesting, so I thought that I let you explain without me interrupting. But yeah, was that a fair assessment from the terrifyingly beautiful artificial intelligence that I have here as an assistant and co-pilot? Could you explain, or feel free, of course, to correct it if it's rambling about information that's not true about you.
No, everything that he said was true. It was very, very effusive praise, actually. If we were on video, you would have seen my cheeks turning red. But no, that's impressive. That's impressive that it was that accurate factually. And it's one thing to pull up facts like, somebody published this book at this time or won this award or, served in this capacity. But, when you get into the content of what the novels are about, I think that's a little more impressive that what was said about those is true. That the content, what it is that I try to accomplish with them. And the fact that that's AI is a little bit impressive and frightening at the same time.
Yep, I absolutely agree. It's a case of I'm not saying that the AI is bad, but a lighthearted statement that keep your enemies closer. Friends close and enemies closer, so to say. That's why I'm doing this podcast, partially at least. But it's absolutely a great tool. A great tool for me. If I wouldn't have you on the podcast, I would had about 50% of the time, maybe even more, trusted the AI in kind of explaining the area here and such. But I have a follow-up question, kind of now segueing into your career as an author. That do you have the first? And maybe I should mention here, I have not published anything yet, but I have a passion for this because for years, it takes time, but for years I have been writing my own fantasy novel. And my question is that do you have a memory of that first spark when you wrote something, maybe a word or a sentence or maybe a paragraph or a chapter or a book? Whatever it is, it could be as far back as in school or something. But do you have a single, a one memory of that spark that kind of gave you the affirmation that you have some talent in this field?
Yeah, for me it was ever since I was very young, maybe 10 years old. I just always I thought of myself as a writer, like a musician might just always kind of feel like, hey, I'm going to be a musician. So they pick up a guitar and they start playing or piano or whatever, and it's just always a part of their life, even if it's not necessarily the profession that they go into or their main profession.
Yeah.
So for me, there wasn't like I have writer friends who had a career and then they retired or near the end of their career, they felt like I should write a book about this, and they come to writing later in their lives. And I think they'd have a different answer. They'd have more probably more of the answer you're looking for, where they had that moment, that spark.
Yeah.
For me, it's always been there.
All right. That's interesting. For me, it was a mix between I'm kind of lost in my life, career-wise, and then a passion for, well, entertainment in general. And I believe if I remember right, you mentioned that also on your website, that TV in general and entertainment. And as the AI mentioned, the guitar playing, yep, I like that also, but I'm terrible at it. So that's just something I like to listen to. Okay. I have a promise.
We should start a band.
Yeah, yeah. I have made a promise to myself.
Two terrible guitar players.
Yeah, but yeah, interesting to hear, kind of that you have always had it. I got it, the 19th of August 2000. No, sorry, the 12th of August 2019. That's the day I got the spark. I'm not gonna go into that too much because it's not published, but yeah, that's the moment for me.
That's wonderful that you had that moment. I think that's a very cool experience. I
have one of those.
I can't relate.
Yeah.
I can't relate to it directly, but I mean, from a outsider standpoint, it seems like it would be like a moment of inspiration and would be powerful. That happens to be my birthday, actually, so we have that in common as well.
Oh,
yeah.
That's a coincidence. I wish I could remember the date before. I have one more moment that I saw, actually, a documentary. Not gonna share. Well, I can share it. It was Cosmos, I think, the name, where Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about space in general. So, yeah, that's partially out there now. But yeah, that was one moment before when I kind of got one of those epiphanies, if that's the right phrase. But yeah, but yeah, interesting to hear. I'm not comparing myself with you, but maybe I can compare that much that I have written extensively for some years now. I'm not finished, so the grind maybe is similar between two. One is a published author and the other is striving to be one. So I can maybe relate to that, but otherwise you have way more experience in that field than me.
Well, the thing about fantasy is, like, it's a genre that, like, when I write in the crime genre, I'm placing the story in a version of often Spokane, not always, but that already exists, and anything that's different in that universe, so to speak, it's a minor aberration from the reality that we all know.
Yeah.
So for instance, River City instead of Spokane, the Looking Glass River instead of the Spokane River, Mount Joseph instead of Mount Spokane. These are differences that take very little time to create and are pretty easily understood, and you can move on to the story.
Yeah.
But when you're writing a fantasy novel, I mean, there's so much world building that goes into that.
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
I think that the process is just considerably slower. I mean, the fantasy series that I'm working on as Frank Zafiro, I've finally reached a point where my cover artist is doing the cover art for the first book and some of the other associated art. But all I've written of it in draft form is the first chapter. Everything else has been background and note taking and creation, and
so
not just
nice to
about the story, but
please continue.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, well, I was about to say that it's so nice to hear somebody who, I mean, without me saying anything, I'm absolutely agreeing with everything you said regarding fantasy authorship, if that's right saying it that way. 95% is seems to be a background work, and 5% is the actual book. I can imagine in the future. So.
Yeah, and because I think you have to do so much more foundational work, and then of course the story, just like any other book, and readers have expectations. I mean, in a police procedural like River City or Charlie 316, they want to see something of what the process the police go through is like. That's what the subgenre is. It's Yeah. All right. So if you are going to write that element needs to be included. Well, fantasy readers, they want to be transported to another world universe, essentially, right? Yeah. And they want to be able to understand that world. They want to be able to be part of that world. And so you can't just like do a half-assed job of it, to be blunt. You can't do a surface level job of it. You have to you have to show them the depth of the world. Yeah. Now, I for one am in favor of
fantasy,
right, yeah, and now I for one am in favor of more of the method that I noticed Joe Abercrombie using in his First Law series, which is there's a great deal of depth to this world, but it's all shown to you through the eyes of the point of view characters, and there's not a lot of pausing and explaining. It's just, this is the way it is, pick it up from the context, and I like that. Some readers prefer a little bit more of a methodical explanation. It depends on the reader, but in either instance, you have to have the foundation set. You have to know it yourself as the writer, and even if there are some facts that don't explicitly come out, the fact that they're there and exerting influence will affect those facts that do come out. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why, I mean, I've had this fantasy series brewing, for a decade. I'm just now reaching the point where I'm getting close to starting on the actual story in a way similar to the way I've written my other books. Like, okay, now I'm doing a first draft, and then I'll be off and running. But all the foundational work, it's not just about making up city names and creating a map and whatever, like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign or something. Yeah. You have to consider things like social dynamics and creating the society and understanding the culture of that society and the history of that society. And so
and the butterfly effect,
I think
fort and so on. Then,
And so I think, many prospective fantasy writers, I think, will never get past this phase because they become paralyzed because they can never complete it. And I don't think you can. I think you as the writer have to at least know enough of it to be able to share the part that you know with the reader, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense completely. This is absolutely amazing that we speak about this because, as you said just now, that you have this. It's kind of I emphasize again. I try to make my what's the saying, to be at ease with the fact that I am never going to finish this universe and book that I'm working on in my lifetime, if that makes sense. But I have to know enough of it so that I can get out a novel at some point. But I'm so deep into it that it. If I think if you do a good enough job with the background and the laws and whatever, the cultures and the butterfly effect, how everything affects another, then it could be. And I'm not saying that my work is going to be that, but in general, when you write something good, or make a fantasy location, so to say, it can live its own life, and we see that with. You said you are a Star Trek fan. I am a I'm not sure if the right phrase is a sucker for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and such fantasies. So Witcher series is also something I really love. So yeah, they live their own life, and the fans keep on going with it. And if it's really well done, I'm not sure. And this is not sponsored by any mean, but there are these, I think, Men of the West or some other YouTube channels that do like investigation into the lore of Mr. Tolkien's universe. Stuff that he has not written down, but they can kind of figure it out, so to say. Investigation like you have worked with in your career.
Yeah, there. In Deep Geek is another one that does really good 10 to 15 minute little micro investigations into Tolkien, into George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, The Witcher, and a few other fantasy series. And yeah, I mean, fantasy readers are very discerning. They're very dedicated. They're very loyal. And, you know, I mean, I grew up as one. That was fantasy and science fiction was the first genre I really glommed onto as a reader. And I'm very excited to be returning to that genre as a writer. Under my pen name, Frank Severio. The fantasy series is called Seasons of Wither. And at present, it's projecting as a quadrilogy, as a 4-book arc. The first book is called A Burnt Summer, and I'm actually going to try something different that I haven't done before with this book. Once the art work is done, or at least a good portion of it, I'm going to give Kickstarter a try and see if that's a route toward producing the book that is viable and works. So people can watch for that. If they go to frankseverio.com, there'll be some updates on it eventually. Sooner rather than later, I expect by the fall I'll have the campaign up and running, and maybe it'll fund and maybe it won't. Maybe it'll go crazy viral, maybe it'll fail. I have no idea, but I figure it's worth an exploration. And the neat thing about something like Kickstarter is that if it does generate a lot of interest from prospective readers, Kickstarter as any crowdfunding campaign has stretch goals, and so you can all but guarantee you're going to get a certain distance in the project. Up front. Say I'm just going to do the first book for the Kickstarter campaign, but perhaps it'll do well enough to fund all 4 books or an audio version or additional artwork or something, and it'll be an adventure. As an independent author, I've not taken the Kickstarter route before, so it'll be something new. But when you get to the point where you're ready to publish, and I'll always try to remember the saying that no book is ever finished, no art is ever finished, it's just released.
I agree.
When you get to that point, I hope you'll remember to shoot me a message so that I can take part in it and read it and help promote it.
Really, that would be lovely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I mean, the reality is especially in the independent author realm, but authors in general, it's in my experience is not a cutthroat business, but by any means amongst the artists themselves. It's not a zero-sum game like many sales, are. I mean, my writing partner in the Shawty 316 series, his day job is he's a real estate broker. And that's a zero-sum game, right? I mean, either he makes the sale or somebody else makes the sale, but right? And somebody gets, a commission and somebody gets zero. But in the world of books, I mean, a reader might read my book and then read your book, or read your book and then read my book, and that happens all the time. And so rather than me try to get them to buy my book instead of your book, how about I try to get them to buy your book, and if they buy mine as well, then that's great, and they can read both. And so we have the luxury, I think, as artists, to be able to be more inclusive, because it isn't a zero-sum game. I mean, at some point somebody can only read so many books, right?
Yeah, of course.
But that's a pretty big number, and I think most of us can get in under that number. So how about we support each other? And I've been very fortunate to be around writers who feel that way, and in the crime fiction community and elsewhere, that's a pretty supportive group when it comes to talking each other's books up. And when you're talking across genres, if you're a crime writer and you're sitting next to a romance writer at some kind of an event, somebody's looking for a book, they're not interested in mysteries, but they love romance. I mean, there's your opportunity to send them to the other writer and make a happy reader. It costs you nothing, and it makes two people happy. So why wouldn't you do it?
Exactly. And I am now at my turn to so-called blush here, because I am from Finland, and we have a kind of I'm not the right phrase, maybe it's a calm mannerism. Maybe I'm not sure if it's well known in the world, but sometimes you see it on the online.
Oh yeah, it is.
And I'm kind of I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and I hope that it's you can hear it from my voice. But I'm just side mention here. We Finns are like this, but I truly mean it. It's a nice addition to this episode here, to have a small connection maybe in the future.
Absolutely. I have a podcast as well that focuses on promoting crime fiction authors, and I've been very fortunate there as well, because I've been able to promote my friends, for one thing, and then I've met people that have become friends, and so it's a good gig in that regard. And I know we're coming up on kind of the 2-hour mark-ish here, which is kind of my window. I was perhaps going to suggest, I don't know what kind of control you have over the plane, but if it can fly up towards Deer Park, I can show you that little burg that I grew up in, and maybe we could close things out by talking a little hockey, since that's something else that we share.
Great minds think alike. I'm actually, as you can imagine, as a podcaster yourself, so you kind of trying to listen and remember, and then guide the discussion forth. And I was thinking, back when you talked about leadership already, we have a 2-minute flight about to Deer Park here, and I like the idea of adding the visual element. Maybe we do this another time if you have something more you have to talk about, but in general, that we pinpoint and pick up places here from the aerial view is always a welcomed addition. Maybe even the niche, one could say. I'm not sure if you have watched my YouTube channel, Entire Retreat, but there, as I'm with the AI, I'm focusing a lot more on the ground beneath us. But this is always a dynamic concept, so this is absolutely fine. We have maybe gone forth in a more, let's say, traditional podcast manner, but that's quite all right, because there has been a lot of fascinating things to talk about. But yeah, sorry, I'm usually rambling here and talking kind of out my thoughts as I go. Yeah, but the leadership and the hockey, jumping back to that, you said you had Philadelphia Flyers, and I actually have to admit that I was not familiar with the name. Was it that you gave your dog also the name, the captain from Philadelphia Flyers?
Mike Richards was the player.
And you said that he had really a vast set of skills.
Yeah, he was a special player. He had high-end talent.
I mean, he didn't
Is that the airport, the Deer Park Airport?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, so which way is north? Is north to our right?
Upper left corner. We are now heading west.
Okay, yeah. So
right.
we're headed west. Then we're headed towards town because that's the airport. So we'll be getting closer to town here as we fly.
Yeah.
I believe, if my directions are correct. Yeah, Mike Richards had high end talent. I mean, he wasn't the most talented player on the team, but he had high end talent. He had just incredible tenacity and grit. He was a hard nosed player.
Yeah.
And he just had that X factor that you want in a player, and great leadership skills. And he was the team captain the last time the Flyers made it to the Stanley Cup final in 2010, and we lost in 6 games to Chicago on a disgusting fluky goal. So I named my dog Richie because that was his nickname.
Yeah.
And it was a sad day when he got traded, but that's the game that happens.
Yeah.
And but I've been a Flyers fan since the mid '90s, and anytime you're the fan of a team, and you follow that team, closely, every season is like a novel.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these dramas and
Mm-hmm.
storylines, and there's the ups and the downs, and we've been in a pretty long down cycle. So I'm really looking forward to some of the good things that are happening now with some of the draft picks and some of the ways that the management is handling things. So it's a very good time to be a Flyers fan. It was not a very good time for a lot of the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
But we've had some very notable Finnish players on the team.
Filppula comes to
Kimmo
mind.
Timonen.
Yeah, Timonen, yeah.
Yeah. Timonen was a big part of that 2010 run and a big part of the team. And right now, Rasmus Ristolainen is on the defense. He's a big part 55. Of the defense. Yep. And then is Sami Kapanen, is he Swedish or Finnish? I forget. I thought he was Finnish.
Finnish, yeah.
Yeah, he was one of my favorite players during the early 2000s. Just an undersized, scrappy, hardworking player that was very versatile.
Yeah.
And
I actually got a thought. Please continue. I have to ask you.
Go ahead.
That, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No,
no, go ahead. That was it.
Yeah, no. We have the playoffs now, and we got some Stanley Cups, or the Stanley Cup rings. I'm not sure actually the right phrase for the actual ring, the championship ring, I think it is. We got some of those to Finland now, and you said that the Flyers captain was a skilled individual in many aspects. I as a Finn, of course, want to hear your opinion, and there's no right or wrong answer here, but your opinion of the debate that seemed to have taken some air under the wings, pun intended, regarding Alexander Barkov and McDavid in the finals, and in general the best hockey player that now plays actively. So do you have an opinion over that general discussion, let's say?
So are you saying the argument as to whether Barkov or McDavid should have won the Conn Smythe trophy as the best player, most valuable player in the playoffs?
That's it is what it is. I'm not bitter or by any means or something like that. I kind of just want to hear your in your own words that what do you see to be the best aspect in a player? Kind of sounds like you are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you are kind of describing maybe Barkov's play style with the Flyers.
Yeah, I think it's a hard question to ask
it
I
is.
mean, if you're a fan, you can probably just pick your favorite skilled player, and that's the answer, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
if you really think about it, it's more about defining the question to get the right answer. Because if you're
Mm-hmm.
asking me who I think the most physically talented player in the NHL is right now, I think that Connor McDavid has the greatest raw skill set that he is greatly improved
He's a
on
force
during
of
his
nature.
career.
Yeah.
As much as it pains me as a Philadelphia Flyers fan to say so, I think that Sidney Crosby is still
Yeah.
one of the best
All
players
around.
in the
Yeah.
league, and is so much better rounded as a player than someone like McDavid, whose defensive side is still, it's not poor. I mean, I think he gets a little bit of a knock there that isn't entirely fair, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly Crosby has just over the years learned to be so good on both sides of the puck, and that's a skill that Barkov has. And so, I think he's a very talented player as well. Um, I, I think I would have to say that at this moment, the best player is still Sidney Crosby.
Yeah.
Um, I think that
That's not a
McDavid and
bad
Barkov
answer.
are in the top.
Absolutely
In
not.
the
Yeah.
It's a painful answer for me because they're the arch rivals of my team, and Sidney Crosby has chewed us up on more than one occasion, and I've had fun hating him at times. But if you're going to be honest, you got to be honest, and
True.
and
True.
I
Yeah.
think his all-around talent and leadership ability. I mean, I think McDavid is going to get there. I think this. I mean, there's a saying that you got to lose a championship to win a championship. And
Yeah.
if you look back at the history of even someone like Crosby, um, many teams and many core groups of players playing together have lost their first or even second attempt at a championship, and the lessons that they learn are what get them over the top, and they manage to win a championship.
Yeah.
And I think the Oilers certainly experienced that this year. I didn't watch the series other than highlights, but until Game 7, and then my wife and I, she's a big fan as well.
Mm-hmm.
We during the season, that's two three times a week. That's what we're doing. We're watching the Flyers game, but we watched Game 7, and I felt like maybe out of desperation, I thought maybe McDavid was trying to do too much by himself,
Could be.
and
Yeah.
so that's something that maybe if it had worked, they would have praised him for it, and they would have said he put his team on his back and
Yeah.
won a
Yeah.
championship. And if it didn't work, then he was trying to do too much. That's the luxury of being a day after analyst.
Yeah. Of course. In
And so
hindsight.
forth. But yeah, exactly. But I think Finland is always been one of the premier teams in international play. Never in danger of being relegated. Always competitive, always hardworking, hard nosed. And if you look at a lot of the Finnish players, like Ristolainen, for instance, they follow that model,
Yeah.
and
Kind of a workhorse.
those are traits that I yeah, and a willingness to work hard and to hit hard and to play hard and not dirty, just hard. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's one of the things I liked in Richards, and that's one of the things I like in all of my favorite players. My favorite players generally aren't necessarily the stars. They usually end up being third or fourth on the list. It's often those guys who put on their work boots and get their lunch pail and put on their hard hat and toil on the third or
Mm-hmm.
fourth line, but make it possible for the team to do what it's going to do. And I mean, not to get all high-minded about it, but that circles back to our police discussions as well, and the
Yeah.
idea of
I
what
had that thought
leadership is
also.
for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the bulk of any job, gets done by the people on the ground where the rubber meets the road, whether that's a police officer pushing a cruiser or a detective working cases, or what have you. And so the job of leadership is to make it possible for them to do that job. And you have to admire those people who are willing to put their noses down and do that very difficult work. I certainly do, and that's been the types of players that garner my respect and admiration. And I don't buy jerseys and put names on the back and stuff anymore, but if I did, those would be the players whose jerseys I'd be buying.
Yeah. I actually had some questions still regarding the ice hockey. There's the Four Nation Cup coming. Oh, we're actually out of fuel, I see. So I'm trying to land here. Oh, and I'm a terrible pilot. Sorry for shouting. Come on, stop jumping. Oh, I'm drifting an airplane. You don't see that any day.
Well, you missed the trees at least.
Yeah. Yeah, the Four Nation Cup is coming, and then I wonder, have you been ever in a game where like is it IIHF game or something, or a Canada Cup or whatever, an international event? No. Wondered if you had seen Finland play sometime. I've seen the Canadian women play, but never in Czech Republic once, I think, here in Finland. But yeah, well, your thoughts on the upcoming Four Nations Cup? Isn't that like,
I haven't. It'll be neat. It'll be fun. I haven't really looked at the rosters or whatever. I mean, one of the things that these Olympic and other national based teams I think struggle with sometimes is that it's all the best players, and sometimes it's hard for those players to maybe accept certain roles. And if you don't have everybody playing a certain role, then you're not going to be successful. I mean, a team of all-stars is probably going to get beat by a team that's working together with everybody in the right role.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So we'll see which nation is able to best integrate all those great players, because I mean, there's not going to be a single player on any of those teams that isn't,
they're the best
capable
of the best,
playing on the top two lines,
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it'll be fun.
Sorry, we it said 29%, but maybe I had a reserve tank. I'm not a certified pilot, so I'm terrible at flying sometimes, and you see it in the gameplay here. But if you like, we could talk about the area some here, and then kind of I have a habit of promoting tourism or something like that, if that's a valid option. To the area, and kind of ease to the end in this way.
Yeah.
And I can get the AI back idea. If you want. I actually had Spokane's history here, so but maybe that's for another
whatever
time.
Whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be more than willing to come back on another day and maybe explore the region a little more in depth. But I'll just, by way of closing, say that the draw for Spokane is that, I mean, you can see the trees. I mean, this is residential and commercial areas, and it's just dotted with trees, right? It's very much for people who like the outdoors, but it's a viable, vibrant city as well. And one of the things that a lot of people talk about loving is that they can be in the city doing their job or going to a film or whatever they want to do that's a city related activity. They can then get in their vehicle and drive for 30 minutes and be in the middle of the woods.
Yeah.
And that's very so for people who like to camp, people who like to hike, people who like to fish or hunt, or just be outdoors, it's great. If you are thinking of living in the area and and there's land isn't cheap, but there's available land if you wanted to live on, say, a few acres of land. I mean, before we moved down here to Central Oregon, we were living on a 10-acre plot, almost 11, and that was very nice, living out in the country, and it's very quiet and so forth. And so there's still a lot of opportunity for that as well. But Spokane certainly isn't a a small town. I mean, it's up over 250,000 people now, I think.
Yeah.
Which is a fairly decent sized, medium sized city. There's a lot of different kinds of businesses, restaurants, that sort of thing. There's a bustling arts scene across every art style, from music to writing to visual art. I don't know if it's had a comeback or not, but at one time there was a pretty good element of filmmaking that was happening, both local and people using the Spokane area for their films on location. There are a number of movies that were fun to watch because they were filmed in the area. I mean, it's a great place to visit, a great place to live. I had the experience of seeing some of the darker parts of it, and so for me, it's been kind of nice to get away for the last 8 years. And now when I go back, I see the changes. I was just up for in the middle of June, so very recently. It's very nice to see the differences and what people have done to upgrade and change and to evolve the area. And like I said, if you live in the area, you'll recognize a lot in my books, and if you don't, you'll get a flavor for the area from the books, because I do try to accomplish that.
Yeah, and I actually wrote down, taking the credit here. The AI did most of the work, but yeah, as maybe some, or in general, I think the indigenous have lived in the area back whenever. It says thousands of years. But one thing I did not know, and maybe I should kind of ask you this: do you know what Spokane seems to mean? Allegedly, according to the AI, it's actually.
I don't remember. It is Spokane is
Spokane.
An indigenous tribe. Yeah, it's an indigenous tribe, one of several in the area.
Yeah.
And they have the tribe has a very noticeable presence in the city today. But no, what does it mean? Remind me.
It claims that the name means children of the sun.
Oh, that's right. I should remember that.
Yeah.
I tried to. So when I renamed it River City, that obviously meant that anything that in the real Spokane is called Spokane, I'd had to change, right? Spokane River, Mount Spokane, things like this.
Yeah.
And so I tried to pay a little bit of homage to the indigenous peoples with some of those names. So when I had to rename the Spokane River, I named it the Looking Glass River, which is a cool name all by itself, I think. But Chief Looking Glass was one of Chief Joseph's sub-chiefs of the Nez Perce tribe, which was a Pacific Northwest tribe. And then, of course, Mount Joseph was for Chief Joseph. Now, those aren't their native tongue names. Those are the transliterated, English versions of the names. But at least it was, paying some homage to the indigenous peoples of the area. And so that's been the fun part of that conundrum of, I can't call it Spokane Falls Boulevard because Spokane isn't, it's River City. So what do I call it,
Yeah.
And, I can't call it the Spokane River or whatever, Spokane Falls, all of that stuff. So I've had to change it, and having that latitude has allowed me to pay some respect to some of the people who lived there long before, the people who are there now.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think this could actually be, if you don't mind, we could schedule sometime another date and time. But I have
Absolutely.
a concept. Yeah, I have a concept on my channel where I kind of the guiding factor is facts and folklores of different areas, and we have Spokane. Yeah. That's the beauty of the flight simulator, that you could actually take a small village. I think actually 4 days ago I published I have it scheduled, of course, but I published a small vicarage in Sweden that seems to be haunted, and I'm just flying over this small village bit with, I don't know, maybe 150 buildings. Never heard about the place ever. I have been to Sweden, but never been there. And the beauty of the flight simulator is, and with the AI, of course, you can fly over different locations and talk about, let's say, facts and folklores. And Spokane seemed to have a lot of them. Shortly, there's a large fire in 1889. There's the indigenous background. Then there's a World Expo at 74 and such. Maybe, I'm not sure, you were quite young then, so you don't remember it maybe, but but there's a lot of stuff you could...
I do vaguely.
Yeah. You could dive into these wormholes if you want, so maybe we can do that another time.
Yeah, it actually would work really well because one of the books I have coming out in October is the 6th book in the Charlie 316 series called The Silence of the Dead, and it takes place in Spokane, and it's set in 1951, 1974, 2005, and the present. And so and the Expo 74 has a bit of a presence in the 74 section. So maybe we could
is quite
chat.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say we could chat about that and as part of the local folklore and stuff, because we delved into some of the historical things in those time periods. So it's kind of a fun one. I'd be happy to come back and do that.
Yeah, you are welcome to do it also. But yeah, 2 hours up. I could chat longer. It's evening here in Finland, of course. I have to go sleep at some time, but just for the viewers also. Too long is too long. So 2 hours is kind of the cap, I think. But it has been an absolute pleasure, Frank Scalise. Some things I knew about you, and then other things that kind of surprised me in a positive way. So, and a connection also in the process. So really big thanks to you for joining the podcast.
Oh, no, thanks for having me. And I think this is a very interesting concept, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And just a short advertisement here from my part. So you can find entire the retreat as this gameplay version on YouTube. And then pure audio is uploaded to also YouTube, because Google is ending, I think, their podcast future. So pure podcast audio on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Podchaser. And to end this, Frank, if you have anything you want to add, advertise or promote, please, the stage is yours, and we can then end on that note.
Just if anybody's interested in any of the work that I talked about, I'm very easy to find on the World Wide Web. My crime fiction is at frankzafiro.com. And Zafiro is Zafiro. My mainstream work is at frankscalise.com, and my fantasy is at franksaverio.com. And all of these websites are interlinked. If you go to the About Frank page on any of them, the links exist to the other ones, as well as links to my direct buy store where all of my work is available, code4press.com. It's available elsewhere as well, but it's cheaper than retail on code4press.com. And if you like to support the author or the artist, there's a bigger share of it that goes to the artist when you buy direct. So I guess code4press.com and franksafiro.com will get you started on anything you might be interested in. And I appreciate the time to talk about this kind of stuff, and flying around while doing it is pretty fun. I just have only one complaint. My coffee ran out about 15 minutes ago, and nobody came to bring me a refill. So,
yeah, I know the feeling. Thank you. This was fun. Just a mention still by me here. So, Frank here, you are our first guest ever. I hope for more guests in the future. But if anybody who is viewing this is interested, as of right now, I'm not taking any commission. We are a small channel, but if you subscribe to Entired Retreat on YouTube, and join our Discord server. Just send us the so-called evidence, pun intended. We have a police officer in the podcast, so send us the evidence at entiredretreat@gmail.com that you have subscribed and joined our server. Screenshots are fine, and you get a comprehensive guest guide as an answer. That's the only mail I'm going to send you, or that's the only mandatory mail I have to send you. If we discuss by chatting and messaging in different platforms, that's a separate thing. But yeah, rambling here, but long story short, there are possibilities for more or less anybody to join as a remote guest if one so wishes. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, AI Sky. You were not that much what's the word? You were not that much a part of this podcast this time. You have a day off, but that's all right. And that's this podcast. And hope you see that